My name is Edward Wong, and thank you for attending my presentation, Leaving Orientalism for the Bildungsroman, Childhood Narratives in Asian American Musical Theater. I begin my presentation with brief scenes from each of the three works I discuss in this paper. All three were works that I saw performed in New York in 2019, and the protagonists of each of these works are children or adolescents. The first excerpt is from Huang Ruo's one-act opera Bound, and features soprano Fang Taojiang as Diane, a Vietnamese-American teenager. Stanley, Diane's manager, has given her an ultimatum to open the store tomorrow, ignoring her complaint that she will have to miss school. The second excerpt is from An American Soldier, another opera by Huang Ruo. In this aria, Private Danny Chen kneels, his army helmet on the ground in front of him. "I'm sorry, Amma," he laments, contemplating his imminent suicide. His mother looks on behind him, not hearing his words. Now for a bit more levity, this third excerpt is from Yen Li's autobiographical musical Buffoon, premiered by the National Asian Artists Project in May 2019. In this scene, Yen, who moved from China to Saskatchewan, Canada as a child, begins to embrace the exotic way his classmates viewed him.
Asian person in my class. I was the only person I was the expert. Ask me all your questions about China. Show you all the things about Chen and me. I know, it sounds like I thought of myself as a shit back then. I didn't. I mean, I was a little shitty. I can get you oriented in the Orient. I'm so you come like something or two. I can make you oriented. All you need is an Asian tongue, so every
In In this paper, I argue that these three works, Bound, An American Soldier, and Bethune, reflect a departure from the Orientalist precursors that have heretofore defined the Asian subject in opera and musical theater. They are a microcosm of the recent outpouring of second-generation Asian American stories dealing with cultural representation. Motivated by my desire to connect Asian American theater, music, and youth studies, I illustrate how storytelling techniques express a yearning for belonging endemic to the Asian American condition. I co-opt the framework of the Bildungsroman as applied to Goethe as well as Asian American literature. This framework is varyingly reinforced and subverted as protagonists routinely acquire wisdom on their journeys, but are nonetheless bound by shackles of racial and cultural difference. The term Bildungsroman was primarily associated throughout the 19th century with Johann Wolfgang von Goethe's novel, Wilhelm Meister's Apprenticeship. A Bildungsroman is a coming-of-age story in which a protagonist experiences moral and/or spiritual growth during a period from youth to adulthood. Todd Kantia argues that the Bildungsroman is a, quote, fundamentally affirmative conservative genre, confident in the validity of the society it depicts, and anxious to lead both hero and reader toward a productive place in the world. Indeed, the Bildungsroman is preoccupied with achieving a missing sense of belonging. Lisa Lowe describes this process as, quote, the reconciliation of the individual with the social order, a narrative of the individual's relinquishing of particularity and difference through identification with an idealized national form of subjectivity. A Bildungsroman traditionally ends with a narrative closure in which the protagonist achieves belonging. However, narrative closure does not always happen, particularly in ethnic Bildungsromane, a term reclaimed by literature scholars to describe 20th century coming-of-age novels by people of color. As Viet Thanh Nguyen points out, quote, closure does not exist for African Americans in novels such as Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man. Instead, these works exhibit a sense of perpetual double consciousness. Similarly to later Asian American novels, inner realization is achieved, but not acceptance by society. In the table labeled Figure 1 on my handout, I list literary elements within three Bildungsromane, Goethe's Wilhelm Meister, as well as two Asian American novels written in the 1990s by Frank Chin and Nora Okja Keller. Bildungsromane commonly share many traits. The protagonist may experience a loss of innocence, separation from family, or disillusionment. She's often a sensitive person looking for answers, searching for an identity. After experiencing psychological or moral growth, she comes to terms with the world she lives in. These literary elements are not always clearly delineated. For example, in Keller's Comfort Woman, one might argue that the mother, Akiko, in bravely coming to terms with her past traumas, undergoes a more profound transformation than her daughter. There is a clear similarity with the opera Bound. In both works, the mother's past trauma becomes a point of connection between mother and daughter. One might similarly contemplate, as I do in Figure 2, whether it is Diane or her mother, Khan, who undergoes a more significant growth journey in Bound. In adapting the Bildungsroman framework to musical theater, certain dispensations must be made. Unlike a novel, an opera or musical is performed live and must occupy some tangible length of time. The scope of growth that can be achieved is limited by the performer's physical body and the work's temporal constraints. Since neither Diane's nor Khan's growth journey can be fully realized within the opera's short time span, it might make more sense to view Bound as a snapshot within a growth journey, one which implies rather than explicates closure. Diane's first words in the opera Bound are me oi, words that are repeated several times throughout. The word oi is particular to the Vietnamese condition. Aaron Kuen Yin calls it the most heart-aching word in the Vietnamese language. Oi is an echo, an affirmation, both a request for and a source of comfort. As Diane sits in county jail alone as punishment for missing school, her me oi is a primal incantation, not just hello mother, but an urgent call for help. Where are you tonight, she asks. Why did you leave me with my shadow looming like a black bird? How could a mother leave her daughter to fend for herself, to work herself to exhaustion every night? In scene 3, a surrealistic Khan, perhaps a figment of her daughter's imagination, visits Diane in jail. The audience learns that Khan's actions were linked to her traumatic memories of a war-torn Saigon. My leaving was a poison, in my blood a war wound. Khan sings strident intervals such as a minor ninth, exhibiting frenetic anguish. The orchestration is similarly hectic, playing sextuplets and combinations of the piano, flute, clarinet, and violin. Khan's parents were killed during the war. Father and mother, forgotten on a hillside, I never buried them. Where are they now? I must leave before I am left. In the Asian American Bildungsroman, the second generation must often share the lingering burden of their parents' trauma. Diane tells her mother, "Your poison is in my blood, too. I am bound to your leaving, bound to your sadness." According to Viet Thanh Nguyen, for Vietnamese Americans, quote, two generations share a melancholic attachment to a traumatic past, caught up as some are in an imaginary Vietnam that they have left behind that may have little relationship to contemporary Vietnam. In An American Soldier, Private Danny Chen similarly faces obstacles to belonging in America. At the surface level, these were his fellow soldiers and commanding officer, who abused Chen with racial slurs and singled him out for his ethnic background. But Chen's story speaks more broadly about the challenges of becoming accepted by peers and authority figures when marked by racial difference. Private Chen's aria, "I Was Born Here," evokes law professor Frank Wu's claim that Asian Americans are often seen as perpetual foreigners. Even though Chen was born in New York, he sings about being asked the vexing question, "Where are you really from?" The ironic sadness in Private Chen's story is that he enlisted in the army out of love for America, a country that preaches inclusion and diversity. In the opera's final scene, Mother Chen is left on stage, clad in funerary black, holding a framed portrait of her deceased son. She sings the following words. There we go. As the music crescendos with the addition of bells, the deceased Private Chen emerges in full uniform from behind his memorial to sing in unison with his mother. I wish I could hug you. The orchestra plays several pulsating, strident dissonances as Mother Chen embraces her son. There's a striking similarity between the surrealistic scenes in Bound and An American Soldier. Both Mother Chen and Khan are physically distanced from their children, yet their on-stage juxtapositions suggest that their American dreams are intertwined. Sociologist Pyong-Gap Min writes that, quote, no matter what levels of acculturation and intergenerational mobility they achieve, the children and grandchildren of today's second-generation Asian Americans may continue to encounter rejection and treatment as less than full American citizens. While the Bildungsroman traditionally ends with the protagonist's realization about how to position himself within the social order, An American Soldier instead presents a cautionary tale, one that rejects the possibility of Private Chen's Bildung. If An American Soldier subverts the Bildungsroman by remarking on its lack of achievability, Yang Li's Bethune does the same by parodying elements of identity-themed musicals. Though the show's title refers to Canadian physician Norman Bethune, revered in China for aiding Mao Zedong and the communists during World War II, the naming of Bethune was instead an intentional ploy to get audiences to think about the ubiquity of white savior narratives in Asian American musicals. Bethune is not Norman Bethune's story, but Li's own childhood story. How he moves to Saskatchewan and learns to speak English, how he grapples with being the only Asian kid in his third grade class, how he fantasizes about offering Tegan, his first crush, a mooncake. Bethune demonstrates that Asian American musical theater is not circumscriptive of geography, that is, the United States or Canada, but rather constitutes a dialogical response to historical Orientalist depictions on Broadway. By pulling a bait and switch to foreground his own story rather than Bethune's, Lee subverts the legacy of musicals such as The King and I, in which the I privileged a white Western perspective. Furthermore, Bethune's structure as an extended monologue challenges musical theater convention. Lee's initial plan was to remain on stage for the entire show, with his monologue interrupted by sung interludes from the cast that gave further emphasis to his words. But during the show, rather than have Lee deliver his own monologue, director Robert Lee decided to have members of the chorus step out and take turns portraying Lee. There may have been a symbolic meaning in having each performer assume the role of Lee for a bit, as if to vicariously share in his growth journey. While the actors in Bethune were of different Asian backgrounds, Filipino, Chinese, Korean, Indian, and grew up in different parts of the US, they shared the common experience of being second-generation Asian American. I argue that by taking turns playing Lee, cast members were able to inflect his character with a composite of their own myriad life experiences. Unlike the muted endings of Bound and American Soldier, the final scene of Bethune is a rousing anthem in which Lee sings the following. Although this ending implies narrative closure, the composer describes it as a tongue-in-cheek jab at overwrought musical theater finales. By parodying musical theater norms, Lee causes us to question whether he has, in fact, achieved belonging. In effect, Bethune asserts its individuality as a show through a dialogically adjacent positioning with more identity-based shows whose aesthetic Lee parodies. Such meta-theatricality is a revealing sign that an Asian American theatrical ethos is beginning to take shape. Just as ethnic and Asian American Bildungsroman depart significantly from the historical usage of this term, applying the Bildungsroman framework to Asian American musical theater works requires consideration of specific discourses unique to the genre. Historically inaccurate, cliched portrayals of Asian characters in musical theater have often necessitated an authorial approach that enumerates expressivity and individual difference rather than attempted assimilation. In Bethune, Lee's journey to making Canada his home was not catalyzed by renunciation of his individual differences, but through a negotiated embrace of both Chinese and Canadian elements of his upbringing. Yet Lowe's concept of the Bildungsroman as a conservative narrative of the individual's relinquishing of particularity is nonetheless useful in making sense of the pressures faced by protagonists in all three of these works. Just as Asian American Bildungsromane often lack narrative closure for their protagonists, in both Bound and An American Soldier, the protagonist's maturation is ultimately insufficient to overcome racial and cultural difference. Finally, the yearning for belonging common to the three works discussed in this paper provides a microcosmic view of the challenges facing second-generation Asian American youth in the early 21st century. Through the expressive agency afforded by the musical theater idiom, artists reimagine, raise awareness of, and impart significance to Asian American childhood narratives. Thank you.